Hi there, it's Dr. Gianna Reams, and we're going to talk today about what killed Alexander the Great. It's been a little while since I've been able to make a video, partly for technical reasons. UNO has been involved in a IT migration to a new server, and that kind of got in the way of things. And then I've been teaching a summer class on public history, so I had very compressed. I had to do that in a hurry. But I thought I'd go ahead and tackle what may have killed Alexander. There was an article in Live Science out this past year that discussed some various theories. They did mention me in the article. I will put links to all of the articles. As usual, I always try to include links to all of the articles mentioned in a video so that you can go and find them for yourself. And it went through a variety of theories. There'll also be some other things coming out, I think, in the next year or so on Alexander's death. And periodically, these things roll around. You know that people want to talk about this or that in Alexander's life. When it comes to Alexander's death, despite modern tendencies to say, oh, well, you've got the fever theory, the poison theory, the drinking himself theory, the various other, he got eaten by a shark or something, some really weird ones that are out there. In reality, in the ancient sources themselves, there are really only two threads. And these break down into he died of a fever infection of some sort versus poison. Okay. And while today the drinking gets talked about as if it's a separate thing, in antiquity it wasn't. Okay, so the alcohol was the means of administering the poison. So these were not actually separate things. And it's really modern tendency to try to pull these apart, not ancient presentations of them. So we're going to deal first with the fun conspiratorial was he poisoned theory, and the too long didn't read answer is no, he was not. And there's a couple of reasons for that I'll go into in just a bit, but I do want to point out that one of the issues, well, I should say that there's a couple of big issues in addressing this question. One of them is very simple. We don't have his body, all right? It ain't there. We cannot do an autopsy on him. Ergo, the only evidence we have is literary. So even though people bring in the doctors, and they're very useful, obviously they have experience in looking at symptoms, they're still prisoners of our evidence. And I keep coming back to that phrase, we are prisoners of our evidence, when we're not looking at, archaeology in the sense of a body or bones or anything. All we've got is literary evidence. And that means we're facing a different sort of problem. That's that sources problem that, I've mentioned before. Historiography. Do we trust our sources? Why should we? Why shouldn't we? And as I said, in the ancient sources, there are actually two threads running among the descriptions of Alexander's death. And the older one is the fever theory. So again, we'll come back to that. I want to talk about the poison theory. Macedonian kings were assassinated. If not all the time, at least it wasn't uncommon. Alexander's own father, Philip, was assassinated. Archelaus was assassinated. Alexander's uncle, the Alexander II, by the way, our Alexander is Alexander III, or Alexandros. Remember, his name in Greek is Alexandros. So the second Alexander, who is Philip's eldest brother, he was also assassinated. So when we are, and these are just the ones we know of, there may well have been others. But here's an important thing about assassination. Poison is a woman's weapon. So here you got to understand the cultural cues. And yeah, poison is neat, and others, poison's sneaky. And that's what women do. When men kill other men, they do it to their faces, ideally, and with steel. So, yeah, Philip's assassinated with a knife. Alexander II, he's killed during a dance in armor, so he's probably killed with a spear or a sword. Archelaus was killed in a hunting accident with a spear. That's how you kill kings. That's how men kill kings. Women use poison, and that matters. Because when we are talking about Alexander, we have to look at who is being accused. All right. And this is Antipatros. Antipatros and accomplices, of whom one is reportedly Aristotle. Okay. And they're using, so you got to know the whole poison theory. It's not just poison, it's very specific. That this is poison from this river of the underworld that is so horrible that you have to carry it in the hoof, okay, of a horse or an ass. I don't exactly remember which, but it's in a hoof. And you can't put it in a regular vessel or eat through it. It's that terrible. And it's administered by Iolaus, the cupbearer of Alexander, who just happens to be Antipatros' son, his youngest son. And they administer it in wine, although why wouldn't eat through the wine cup? Whatever. We're not going to deal with the details here. Okay. This is all meant to blacken Antipatros' name, specifically during the Wars of the Successors. All right? So that's what we're looking at here. This is a smear campaign. And it's not enough to just accuse Antipatros of killing the king. Oh, no. He did it like a woman. Okay. This old man, he's not tough enough to really be king. He murders people like a woman. All right. That's the messaging. All right. When modern physicians look at the description of the symptoms, they will tell you, yeah, there's not any known poison that acts the way that it supposedly would. Okay. It's not poison. Okay. He was not poisoned. He was not assassinated. There were plots against his life. There were two we know of, possibly really maybe three, or one earlier that we know of. But he didn't die from an assassination. Sorry, conspiratorial fans, okay? The drinking is part of that, and this is something that's very important. The wine wasn't what killed him, from their point of view. It was what was in the wine. And so when he gets up and he drinks this big cup of wine, it's not alcohol poisoning. It's the poison that's supposedly in the wine that causes him to cry out. And guys, some of this stuff is just flipping made up. They do that. They lie, just like people lie today, okay? So that is a thread, and that thread belongs to the successor era, the successor wars, the Debunking, the fights that followed Alexander's death. Okay, so that's that thread, and the alcohol is a part of this. Could he have drank himself to death? No, not really. For one thing, it took too long. That's not, again, how alcohol poisoning works. Arguably, the cup he supposedly drank is literally too big for the contents to be held in the stomach. Your stomach isn't big enough for it, okay, in one go. So there are lots of issues with this poisoning story. So let's take that and let's set it aside, all right? It's a great story. Didn't happen. So what about fever? And if fever, what kind of fever? Okay. There's been some various, comments on it. Malaria has been put forward. Typhoid has been put forward. Particularly in the 1990s, mid-late 1990s, the Maryland School of Medicine had a symposium where they would analyze a figure from ancient history, and they drag in a historian to help them understand the sources, so they were reading them correctly. Historiography was a thing. And then they would take the symptoms and they would diagnose what seemed to them the most likely. And so the University of Maryland took on Alexander, and they published the results in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1998, if I remember right. And again, this will all be in the notes. show notes so you can go read their analysis for yourself. And they decided that it was likely not malaria, but typhoid with ascending paralysis. So that was their final analysis. And Gene Borza was their historical consultant, so he is on the article as well. So he's their historical expert, and not just a historian, but an expert on Alexander who understands the problems of not just ancient sources, but ancient sources dealing with Alexander. Okay. And that's lovely. I don't disagree with it. In fact, Gene and I later published an article, which again, in the show notes, that carried this a little bit further, and we put it in terms for our historical buddies. So typhoid is possible. Malaria, I think, is still on the table. I don't think we can axe it, and I'll explain why in a minute. Nile fever, I think, is another Nile disease. Guillain-Barré syndrome has also been suggested. Now, Guillain-Barré syndrome is not a fever disease. It's not an autoimmune. In fact, it is an autoimmune disease. It's not an infectious disease. I'm a little less convinced by that one. But again, I'm not going to put it entirely off the table. All right, so let's go back to why I said I don't think malaria should be excluded. Okay. And that is because in ancient Macedonia, not one, but both mosquitoes that carry malaria were endemic in antiquity. Now, not so much today. There's a little bit of marshland left up on the coast as it goes in the Thermicus Gulf, not far south of Thessaloniki. But most of the marshland that used to cover Lower Macedonia is gone today. It's been dredged. In fact, today Macedonia is a breadbasket of Greece. They grow great crops. But in antiquity, marsh was an issue, and so mosquitoes were an issue, and so malaria was an issue up there. Malaria is also endemic in Babylon. So Alexander may very well have had, like a lot of kids may have had malaria as children. He may have been reinfected when he was in Babylon. We know he went on a boat through the Babylonian March. So yeah, he could have been reinfected with malaria. So I don't think this is impossible. Now, again, the physicians at the Maryland School looked at this and they came to their conclusions based on the symptoms and the symptomology of it. So let me come to the next, to my mind, issue with the symptoms. And I believe, if I don't misremember, in my article, or not article, I should say, the video about did Alexander go crazy with grief, I mentioned this article by Thomas Africa that is Worms and the Death of Kings. And in this, Africa isn't talking about Alexander. Alexander's not even named in the article. He talks about Sulla, he talks about Herod, and he talks about some other Romans as well, who supposedly died from worms, intestinal worms. Well, we call them intestinal worms because, yes, intestinal worms are a thing. It's kind of gross, but it happened. It's not common, but it happened. So people say, oh, they could have had these intestinal worms. But here's the problem. Symptoms of diseases, especially those that carry you off, in ancient sources, are often moral. It's not about what they actually die of. It's a moral commentary. So Sulla's an awful person. Herod is an awful person. Ergo, they die from worms. They were eaten from the inside by their evilness. Okay? Can we trust these reports? So, this is why I'm a little skeptical of the details of some of the symptoms, right? Particularly in Alexander's case, we don't have worms or anything. But, we do have this whole drinking issue, and that Alexander's drinking wine instead of water when he's got a fever thing. This is not a commentary necessarily on what he actually drank. It is a commentary on Alexander. Remember, the later authors who are writing this stuff are using him as a negative exemplar. Bad example. Okay. So I think we have to take the symptoms very gingerly. And not just for him, but for Hephaestion, who dies 8 or 9 months earlier as well. Same issue. Remember, as the ancients are writing him, he is Alexander too. So he is meant to mirror Alexander, same moral tropes that we're dealing with. So when we're thinking about these descriptions of Alexander's death. This is what we are contending with. Not just imprecise symptom reports, but moral overlay on symptoms that are already imprecise. How seriously can we take them? So I think while we can move the poison off pretty securely, when it comes to the fever disease, I think it's a lot harder to say from the symptoms what kind of fever, right? Now, the last piece of this is, well, you're saying that, alcohol didn't have any effect. And no, not really saying that. I'm saying the alcohol is connected to the poison. Did he drinking, and again, I've done a video on Alexander the Great drunk with, did he drink too much? This is a piece, and this is where you have a difference between cause and contributing factor, all right? So there were at least 3, I think, contributing factors toward the end of Alexander's life that probably made it difficult for his body to recover from whatever disease this was. Malaria, typhoid, something else entirely. So yes, he dies just before his 33rd birthday. He's relatively young. He is in good health, but not. And that's the catch. Yeah, he's out there, he's exercised, etc. But he is also taking a god-awful number of wounds, including one very significant one in India, in Malaya, the siege at Malaya, where an arrow pierced his left upper chest and apparently pierced his lung. So he had a deflated lung. That almost killed him. It took him months to recover. The fact that he recovered at all speaks to his constitution, but also helped destroy his constitution. And he's had all of these other wounds as well. He says at one point that he's been wounded by every weapon used by human beings, from being hit by catapult stones to arrows to swords to spears, etc. So, his body's taken a beating. So that's a contributing factor. He's just not he's 32, but he's not in great health, despite being young. Second, bereavement. Okay, so let's talk about that briefly. Hephaestion did die about 8 to 9 months ahead of him, sometime in late October, early November, we think. I don't care if you believe Hephaestion was his lover or was not his lover, or they were lovers as children. The one thing that is absolutely certain is this: Hephaestion was his emotional center. He was the ground of Alexander's being, if you will, and that just got yanked out. He was the one person that Alexander trusted, and he's gone. He's dead. Among the toughest bereavements for people to get over is the loss of a spouse. And again, I don't care if you think they were lovers or not. Functionally, Hephaestion was like a spouse to Alexander. They had known each other, at least I think, since they were children, or at least teens, since they were students under Aristotle. Okay, and I do think they were lovers, at least in their youth. And now he's gone. And Alexander's trying to recover from this. And bereavement takes a long time. It's not like, boom, you're over it in a couple of weeks. Okay? Even if they weren't lovers and he was simply a very, very dear friend, like brothers, it doesn't matter. That emotional tie that those two had was extremely strong. And it takes a while. Okay? So, and again, I've discussed this in the video on Did Alexander Go Crazy with Grief? So go watch that on the impact of Hephaestion on him. So bereavement, and one of the things about bereavement is again, you're kind of working through it, and you don't start to come out of it until about the time Alexander got sick. Okay, and even then, it takes a while. It takes at least a year. So about the time that he was starting to maybe be coming out of the worst depths of bereavement, he gets sick. Okay. Interestingly, one of the effects that bereavement has is on your health. Okay. Well, some of it you can guess. Yes, there's a sort of almost passive suicide for some, particularly men. It's more common with men than women. And that's where they engage in unhealthy activities. So they don't eat well, they don't sleep well. If they smoke, they start smoking more. If they drink more. So things that are going to hurt your health, but they're not actively trying to kill themselves. Okay, so and that may have something to do with the wine intake. Okay? But there's another thing, too, that folks have discovered, and it specifically tends to hit men. So, yes, there is a real thing called broken heart syndrome. It exists. But that's more older widowers and widows. But for particularly widowers, young men, young being in his 30s, it really hits early 30s, that it depresses the immune system. Bereavement specifically depresses the immune system. Doesn't automatically going to mean you get sick, but if you do and you get sick and your body has taken a beating and maybe you're drinking a little more than you should or than you used to, and you're suffering from bereavement, add all of those things in, and it's like, the proverbial, straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. So these were contributing factors. They didn't kill him. That's not what he died of. But they may have had a hand in making him more susceptible than he could have been at another time in his life to whatever fever disease finally got in there and took him out. And again, we don't know exactly what it was. I think malaria or typhoid are the best guesses. But on June 11th, according to the Babylonian Chronicle, on June 11th, not June 10th, Alexander breathed his last. Okay. Again, if it was Guillain-Barré or it was typhoid, then he might have died a little bit later. But I promise you he was dead when the embalmers got done with him. So I don't think there was any conspiracy or any murder of Alexander. I think that maybe the most ironic part of the whole story is that this guy who conquered most of his known world, whether you think that's good or bad, doesn't matter. This guy who conquered most of his known world is taken out by some sort of microscopic organism that he couldn't see and didn't know existed. So there is irony for you.